The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another ordinary day of duty. At 52 years old, Thomas had dedicated 28 years of his life to the Queen's Guard, standing watch over the royal family with unwavering loyalty and discipline. His weathered face bore the marks of countless hours spent in formation, and his steel-gray eyes reflected a lifetime of service that had defined his very existence. Thomas had joined the Guard at the tender age of 24, fresh out of military training and filled with dreams of serving his country and the crown. Over the decades, he had witnessed history unfold before his eyes: royal weddings, state visits, and the changing of generations within the royal family. He had stood motionless through rain, snow, and scorching heat, never once breaking protocol or showing any sign of the personal struggles that occasionally weighed heavy on his heart. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, Thomas took his position near the castle's main entrance, where members of the royal family often passed during their daily activities. The autumn air carried a crispness that reminded him of his childhood in Yorkshire, where he had grown up as the youngest of 4 children in a modest farming family. His father had always spoken with reverence about the royal family, instilling in Thomas a deep respect for tradition and duty that had shaped his entire adult life. As the hours passed, Thomas maintained his characteristic stillness, his mind wandering briefly to thoughts of his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with illness. Margaret had always understood the demands of his profession, supporting him through the long hours and frequent absences that came with guard duty. Since her death, Thomas had thrown himself even deeper into his work, finding solace in the familiar routines and the sense of purpose that his service provided. The castle grounds bustled with the usual activity of staff members, visitors, and security personnel going about their duties. Thomas had learned long ago to observe everything while appearing to notice nothing, a skill that had served him well throughout his career. He could identify the footsteps of different royal family members, distinguish between routine movements and unusual activities, and sense the subtle changes in atmosphere that often preceded important events. Around mid-morning, Thomas noticed a small commotion near the castle's side entrance. Prince George, now 10 years old and displaying the confident bearing that came naturally to his royal lineage, was walking with his personal protection officer toward the main building. The young prince had grown considerably since Thomas had first seen him as a toddler, and there was something distinctly mature about the way he carried himself, even at such a young age. What happened next would remain etched in Thomas's memory forever, though at first it seemed like nothing more than a fleeting moment of childhood curiosity. As Prince George walked past Thomas's position, the young prince suddenly stopped and turned his attention to the guard. For several seconds, the two stood facing each other, the seasoned soldier in his formal red tunic and tall black hat, and the future king in his casual clothes, his bright blue eyes studying Thomas with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. Thomas maintained his rigid posture as protocol demanded, but something in Prince George's expression caught his attention. There was no mischief or playfulness in the young prince's gaze, as one might expect from a child of his age. Instead, there was a quiet thoughtfulness, as if Prince George was seeing something that others might miss. The prince's protection officer stood nearby, respectful of the moment, but ready to intervene if necessary. Then, in a gesture so subtle that most observers would have missed it entirely, Prince George did something that no member of the royal family had ever done in Thomas's long years of service. The young prince reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, handwritten note. Without speaking a word, he placed the note carefully at Thomas's feet, looked up at the guard once more with those penetrating blue eyes, and then continued on his way with his protection officer. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, though his expression remained unchanged. In nearly 3 decades of service, He had never experienced anything like this. Royal family members occasionally acknowledged the guards with a nod or a brief word, but this was something entirely different. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he stared straight ahead, the small piece of paper now resting near his perfectly polished black boots. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. Thomas could feel the presence of the note without looking down at it, and he found himself struggling to maintain the mental discipline that had always come so naturally to him. His mind raced with questions about what the note might contain, why Prince George had chosen to give it to him, and what he should do next according to protocol. When his shift finally ended at noon, Thomas was relieved by another guard and quickly made his way to a private area where he could examine the note without being observed. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the small piece of paper, revealing Prince George's careful handwriting in blue ink. The message was brief, but profound in its simplicity. "Thank you for watching over my family all these years. I know you miss your wife. She would be proud of you." Thomas felt his knees weaken as he read the words again and again, hardly believing what he was seeing. How could a 10-year-old child have known about Margaret? How could Prince George have understood the depth of loss that Thomas carried with him every day? The young prince had somehow seen past the formal uniform and rigid protocol to recognize the human being underneath, acknowledging not just Thomas's years of service, but also his personal grief and sacrifice. The note represented more than just a kind gesture from a member of the royal family. It was a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the boundaries of protocol and tradition. Prince George had somehow intuited that Thomas needed to know that his service mattered, that his loss was seen and understood, and that his dedication had not gone unnoticed by those he had sworn to protect. As Thomas stood in the quiet corridor, holding the note in his weathered hands, he felt tears welling up in his eyes for the first time since Margaret's funeral. The emotional walls that he had built around himself over the years of stoic service began to crumble, replaced by a flood of memories and feelings that he had kept carefully buried beneath his professional exterior. That evening, Thomas sat in his small apartment near the castle, staring at Prince George's note and reflecting on the unexpected turn his day had taken. The simple act of acknowledgement had touched something deep within him, reminding him of why he had chosen this life of service in the first place. It had also forced him to confront the reality of his own mortality and the question of what would happen to his legacy of service when he was no longer able to continue. The note had awakened something in Thomas that had been dormant since Margaret's death, a sense of hope and purpose that extended beyond mere duty and obligation. For the first time in years, he began to think about his future not just as an extension of his past service, but as an opportunity to make choices that honored both his commitment to the crown and his own human needs and desires. As he prepared for bed that night, Thomas carefully placed Prince George's note in a small wooden box where he kept his most precious possessions: Margaret's wedding ring, a few photographs from their early years together, and the medals he had earned during his military service. The note now joined these treasured items as a reminder of a moment when a child's wisdom had penetrated the armor of tradition and touched the heart of a man who had almost forgotten how to feel. The following morning would bring new challenges and decisions that Thomas could not yet imagine. But for now, he simply held onto the warmth of knowing that his years of silent service had been seen and appreciated by someone who truly mattered. Prince George's gesture had planted a seed of change in Thomas's heart, one that would soon grow into something he never could have anticipated. The weeks following Prince George's unexpected gesture brought a profound transformation in Thomas Mitchell's daily routine and inner emotional landscape. Each morning, as he donned his ceremonial uniform, he found himself thinking not just about duty and protocol, but about the human connections that made his service meaningful. The young prince's note had become a catalyst for reflection that Thomas couldn't have anticipated, forcing him to examine aspects of his life that he had long kept buried beneath layers of military discipline. Thomas began to notice details about his surroundings that had somehow escaped his attention during his many years of service. The way morning light filtered through the castle windows created patterns that reminded him of the stained glass in the small church where he and Margaret had been married. The sound of children's laughter from the royal quarters brought back memories of conversations he and Margaret had shared about their dreams of having children of their own, dreams that had never materialized due to circumstances beyond their control. During his shifts, Thomas found himself observing Prince George with new interest whenever the young royal appeared within his line of sight. The prince seemed to possess an unusual awareness of the people around him, often acknowledging staff members with small nods or genuine smiles that went beyond mere politeness. There was something in Prince George's demeanor that suggested an understanding of human nature that seemed remarkable for someone so young. One particularly memorable morning, Thomas witnessed Prince George stopping to speak with an elderly groundskeeper who had been struggling to move a heavy wheelbarrow filled with autumn leaves. Instead of simply walking past, as might be expected of a royal family member, the prince actually helped push the wheelbarrow while engaging the groundskeeper in what appeared to be genuine conversation. The sight of this future king showing such natural compassion and humility struck Thomas deeply, reminding him of the values that had originally drawn him to serve the crown. As the days passed, Thomas began to experience a growing internal conflict between his ingrained sense of duty and a newly awakened desire for personal fulfillment. The note from Prince George had somehow given him permission to acknowledge his own humanity. But this recognition came with complications that he struggled to resolve. For nearly 3 decades, his identity had been entirely wrapped up in his role as a guard, and the idea of existing beyond that role felt both liberating and terrifying. The conflict reached a crescendo during a routine security briefing where Thomas learned about upcoming changes to the guard rotation schedule. Due to budget considerations and modernization efforts, several longtime guards would be reassigned to different positions or offered early retirement packages. The news hit Thomas like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that his era of service might be coming to an end regardless of his personal choices. That evening, Thomas found himself walking through the nearby village for the first time in months, something he had rarely done since Margaret's death. The simple act of moving through spaces where he wasn't bound by protocol felt strange and liberating. He stopped at a small cafe that Margaret had once loved, ordering tea and sitting by a window that overlooked the countryside they had both cherished during their years together. While sitting in the cafe, Thomas encountered Mrs. Eleanor Heartfelt, an elderly woman who had known both him and Margaret for many years. Eleanor had retired from her position as a teacher at the local primary school and now volunteered at various community organizations. Their conversation began with mutual condolences and shared memories of Margaret, but gradually evolved into something more forward-looking and hopeful. Eleanor spoke passionately about her volunteer work with children who had learning difficulties, describing how rewarding it felt to make a meaningful difference in young lives. She mentioned that the local community center was looking for someone to help organize activities for retired military personnel, many of whom struggled with isolation and the transition from structured military life to civilian existence. The position would involve drawing on leadership experience and understanding of military culture to create support networks and meaningful activities. As Eleanor described the opportunity, Thomas felt something stirring within him that he hadn't experienced since his early days of guard service, a sense of purpose that went beyond following orders and maintaining traditions. The idea of using his military experience to help other veterans navigate their post-service lives appealed to something deep in his character that had nothing to do with standing at attention or following protocol. The conversation with Eleanor continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics that ranged from community service to personal healing to the importance of finding new sources of meaning after major life transitions. Thomas found himself speaking more openly than he had in years, sharing thoughts and feelings that he had kept locked away since Margaret's death. Eleanor listened with the patience and wisdom of someone who had spent decades helping others work through difficult periods in their lives. When Thomas finally returned to his apartment that night, he felt as though he had awakened from a long dream. The walls of his small living space, which had previously felt comforting in their familiarity, now seemed confining. The photographs of his years in service, which had once filled him with pride, now represented only one chapter of what could potentially be a much larger story. Over the following days, Thomas found himself paying closer attention to interactions between the royal family members and their staff. He noticed how Prince William and Princess Catherine spoke with genuine interest to the people who worked around them, asking about their families and remembering details from previous conversations. He observed how the younger royals, including Prince George and his siblings, were being raised with an awareness of their privilege that was balanced by genuine respect for others. These observations reinforced the impression that Prince George's note had not been an isolated incident of childhood kindness, but rather a reflection of values that were being instilled throughout the royal household. The young prince was learning to see beyond titles and positions, to recognize the individual worth and contributions of everyone around him. A lesson that clearly extended to acknowledging the sacrifices and service of people like Thomas. The internal struggle between loyalty to tradition and personal growth continued to intensify for Thomas. He found himself questioning assumptions that had guided his life for decades, wondering whether true service to the crown might sometimes require stepping back to make room for fresh perspectives and new approaches. The idea felt almost treasonous to someone who had built his entire identity around unwavering dedication, but it also felt honest in a way that surprised him. During a particularly quiet shift, Thomas noticed Prince George walking through the castle gardens with what appeared to be a school assignment, carefully observing and sketching various plants and trees. The prince's concentration and genuine curiosity about the natural world around him reminded Thomas of his own childhood fascination with the Yorkshire countryside. There was something pure and authentic about the young prince's engagement with his environment that stood in stark contrast to the formal constraints that governed most royal activities. As Thomas watched Prince George work on his assignment, he realized that the young prince represented hope for a different kind of monarchy, one that maintained respect for tradition while embracing genuine human connection and understanding. This realization brought Thomas a measure of peace about his own situation, helping him understand that stepping back from his guard duties might actually be a way of supporting the evolution of the institution he had served so faithfully. The second part of Thomas's journey toward his ultimate decision was marked by a growing sense that his years of service had prepared him for something beyond standing guard. The discipline, leadership skills, and deep understanding of loyalty and sacrifice that he had developed could be channeled toward helping other veterans who were struggling with their own transitions. Prince George's note had shown him that true service sometimes meant recognizing when it was time to serve in a different way. That night, as Thomas sat in his apartment reading Prince George's note once again, he began to draft a letter of his own, one that would set in motion the most significant decision of his adult life. The letter Thomas Mitchell composed that evening would prove to be one of the most difficult and important documents he had ever written. Unlike the military reports and formal communications that had comprised most of his professional writing over the years, this letter required him to articulate emotions and motivations that he had rarely expressed even to himself. The process of finding the right words forced Thomas to confront the full magnitude of the decision he was contemplating. The letter was addressed to his commanding officer, Colonel James Whitmore, a man Thomas had known and respected for over 15 years. Colonel Whitmore had been instrumental in Thomas's career advancement and had personally recommended him for several prestigious assignments during his time with the Guard. Writing a resignation letter to someone who had shown such faith in his abilities felt like a profound betrayal of trust, yet Thomas knew that honesty demanded nothing less than complete transparency about his motivations. In the letter, Thomas carefully explained how Prince George's gesture had catalyzed a period of deep reflection about his future and the ways he might best serve his community and country. He described the opportunity to work with veteran support programs and his growing conviction that his military experience could be valuable in helping other former service members navigate the challenges of civilian life. Most importantly, he tried to convey that his decision to resign was not a rejection of his years of Guard service, but rather an evolution that had been inspired by the same values of duty and service that had originally brought him to the position. Writing the letter took Thomas several days, with multiple drafts that never quite captured the complexity of his feelings. Each version seemed either too sentimental or too cold, too apologetic or too defiant. Finally, he settled on language that was straightforward and respectful, while being honest about the personal transformation that had led him to this crossroads. He included a brief mention of Prince George's note, not to dramatize his decision, but to acknowledge the unexpected catalyst that had helped him recognize the possibility of serving in different ways. The morning Thomas submitted his letter, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety that reminded him of his first day of Guard duty nearly 3 decades earlier. The familiar weight of uncertainty about the future was balanced by a sense of rightness about the decision that gave him strength to move forward. Colonel Whitmore's response came within hours, requesting a private meeting to discuss the resignation and explore whether there might be alternatives that could address Thomas's concerns while keeping his valuable experience within the organization. The meeting with Colonel Whitmore took place in a small office overlooking the castle grounds where Thomas had spent so many years of his life. The colonel was a pragmatic man who understood the challenges of maintaining morale and purpose among long-serving military personnel, and he listened carefully as Thomas explained his reasoning. What surprised Thomas was how easily the words came once he began speaking honestly about his experiences since Margaret's death and his growing sense that he needed to find new ways to contribute meaningfully to his community. Colonel Whitmore acknowledged that Thomas's situation was not unique, and that many veteran Guards struggled with questions about their identity and purpose as they approached the end of their service careers. He offered Thomas the option of transitioning to a training role where he could help prepare new Guards while maintaining his connection to the organization, but Thomas knew instinctively that such a compromise would not address the deeper need for transformation that he was experiencing. During their conversation, Colonel Whitmore shared his own observations about changes within the royal household, particularly the emphasis that the younger generation of royals placed on authentic engagement with the people around them. He mentioned that Prince George had specifically asked about Thomas during a recent security briefing, inquiring whether the Guard who had received his note was well, and whether there was anything the family could do to support him during what the prince somehow understood was a difficult period in his life. This revelation that Prince George had continued to think about their brief encounter moved Thomas deeply, reinforcing his belief that the young prince possessed an unusual capacity for empathy and understanding. It also made Thomas's decision feel less like an abandonment of his duties and more like a response to the very values that the royal family was trying to embody. If Prince George could see the importance of recognizing individual humanity within formal structures, then perhaps Thomas's choice to prioritize personal growth and community service was aligned with the evolution of the institution he had served. The formal resignation process took several weeks to complete, during which Thomas experienced a complex mixture of grief for the life he was leaving behind and anticipation for the possibilities ahead. His fellow guards responded to the news with varying degrees of understanding, with some expressing concern that he was making a mistake, and others acknowledging their own similar struggles with questions about life after service. One of the most meaningful conversations during this transition period came with Sergeant David Crane, a younger guard who had served under Thomas's informal mentorship for several years. David had always looked up to Thomas as an example of dedication and professionalism, and he was initially confused and disappointed by the resignation announcement. Their discussion about the decision became an opportunity for Thomas to share insights about the importance of remaining open to growth and change throughout one's life, even when such changes required leaving behind familiar and comfortable circumstances. Through his conversation with David, Thomas realized that his decision was already serving as a form of teaching and leadership, demonstrating that true service sometimes required the courage to step outside established patterns in order to pursue opportunities for greater impact. This recognition helped Thomas feel more confident that he was making the right choice, even as he acknowledged the sadness of ending a chapter of his life that had provided structure and meaning for so many years. The community center position that Eleanor Hartwell had mentioned proved to be even more substantial and meaningful than Thomas had initially understood. The role involved not just organizing activities for veteran groups, but also developing partnerships with local organizations, schools, and healthcare providers to create comprehensive support networks for former military personnel and their families. Thomas would be responsible for designing programs that addressed everything from practical concerns like job training and housing assistance to emotional and psychological support for veterans dealing with trauma, isolation, and identity issues. As his final day of guard duty approached, Thomas found himself walking through the castle grounds with new eyes, seeing familiar spaces as part of his history rather than his present reality. The red tunic and black hat that had been his daily uniform for nearly 3 decades felt both heavier and lighter than usual. Heavier with the weight of memory and tradition, lighter with the knowledge that he would soon be free to define himself in new ways. On his last morning as a guard, Thomas took his position near the castle entrance, where Prince George had first approached him with the note that had changed everything. As if responding to some invisible signal, the young prince appeared around mid-morning, once again walking with his protection officer toward the main building. This time, when Prince George saw Thomas, he approached directly and spoke in a clear, confident voice that carried remarkable maturity. "Sergeant Mitchell," Prince George said, "I heard that today is your last day with us. I wanted to thank you personally for all your years of service to my family. I also wanted you to know that I think what you're doing next is very brave and important. Helping other veterans is another way of serving your country, isn't it?" Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion as he responded according to protocol, but Prince George seemed to understand that the formal response couldn't fully capture what Thomas was feeling. The young prince extended his hand for a handshake, a gesture that transcended the usual boundaries between royalty and their protectors. As Thomas shook Prince George's small hand, he felt a sense of completion and blessing that he couldn't have imagined when this journey began. Later that afternoon, as Thomas walked away from Windsor Castle for the last time as a member of the Queen's Guard, he carried with him not just memories of nearly 3 decades of faithful service, but also the knowledge that his next chapter would be shaped by the same values of duty, honor, and compassion that had guided his years of protecting the royal family. Prince George's wisdom and empathy had shown him that true service takes many forms, and that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to one's principles requires the courage to embrace change and growth. Thomas Mitchell's resignation from the Queen's Guard became the beginning of a new kind of service that would touch the lives of hundreds of veterans over the years that followed. His story became a quiet legend within the castle walls, remembered not as an example of abandoning duty, but as a demonstration of how genuine human connection can inspire people to find new ways to make their lives meaningful and their service count.